Let me make two introductory comments. The first is that what we're engaged in is not simply a conversation about politics, although it is that. It's a conversation about public theology. That is a conversation around the way in which our faith commitments engage in public space and engage around the things that actually matter in that public space. So I'm always concerned when Christians say to me, we can't go down that track because that's political. Politics is the art of forming the common life. It's polity. And the stories that are told shape polity. We have a story to tell. There is no way, if we are preaching the gospel, no way if we're talking about God, that we're not engaged in the art of shaping the polity, the politics of the place in which we live. The second comment is a bit about my own story, because part of what we're engaged in today is what was said last night about making allies. And I want to tell you about three features of what I think makes good allies and how that's been shaped in my own story. The first is that being an ally is a long-term adventure. It's not something that you pick up and put down. It's not something you do for one event. It's actually a long-term journey of relationship building with people. I was 18 years old. I had, for foolishness or call of God, decided that I wanted to be a minister of the then Presbyterian Church in Australia. I actually did my last interview on my 18th birthday. Pretty scary. I walked out of church a couple of months later, down the steps of my old church at home. I looked at my companion and said, I think I ought to volunteer to go on a mission venture for 3 months before I go to university. And you know where they sent me? Arakoon. That changed my life. I have tried to understand and walk with and live with First Peoples from the moment of spending time on Arakoon. The second feature, I think, is both an openness to God and an openness to the unexpected. Arakoon was the beginning of that journey. The second one was that after the first 4 years in a parish after I was ordained, the church asked me would I go to West Timor. God or the Indonesians or a combination of both decided that that wasn't where I should go, and I finished up in Darwin. Again, right at the beginning of the life of the Uniting Aboriginal and Islander Christian Congress, drawn into that conversation and its work. The unexpected, though, is I'm one of those rational head kind of people, and I think that to live as people who are allies, we have to open ourselves to some other unexpectedness. Denise talked to us last night, Aunty Denise talked to us last night about a trip to Canada we did. One of those moments probably changed my life forever. We were visiting a cemetery where the children were buried from one of the residential schools. It was a cemetery of just open ground and no marked graves. They'd all been stuck there without recognition. And I walked onto that ground, and I will swear to you for the rest of my life that the children talked to me. I cried for days. They followed me around for days. And I finally had to go to one of the native Canadians and say to them, this has happened to me, and I'm going home, and I need you to tell me what I can do. And so he engaged me in a smoking ceremony, and he told the spirits of the children that I had to go home and they had to leave me alone, and they went away. Somehow or other, we have to disturb our sense of what makes sense if we're going to be good allies. And finally, we simply have to learn to be relational people. We have to learn to listen more than we talk. We'll get enough opportunities to talk. We're largely white people. But we've got to learn to listen first of all. So truth-telling. Why does truth-telling matter? Let me suggest to you 3 reasons. The first is that truth-telling means acknowledging people's experience. It means honouring what they have been through and taking account of the trauma they bear. Sometimes people get re-traumatised because they go through something and then people tell them, no, you didn't. So every time we say to people, no, there were no difficult moments in history, there were no massacres, stolen children or anything else, we re-traumatise people. We do it to women, we do it to Indigenous people, we do it to all sorts of people by denial of experience. Secondly, truth-telling is about challenging the narrative that justifies invasion, dispossession and racist claims about First Peoples. And the third thing is, it is the first step in confession, in reparation and new relationships. Noting that, of course, reparation may occur without reconciliation and certainly without forgiveness. Too often Christians seem to demand that First People forgive them if they simply acknowledge, or we acknowledge, that we've done wrong. But while forgiveness is an important part of building new relationships, it cannot be demanded. I have too often stood in front of groups like you and talked about this, and somebody will stand up and say, but why can't people just forgive me? I'm sick of hearing the story. Well, we can't demand it. A great author called Baker Finch, who has a book called The Dancing God, which is a feminist account of the Trinity, says it takes time for the negative effects of the past to perish to the point that their influence on the world is negligible. That is, forgiveness is not simply an act, but something that emerges over time and maybe never. Reconciliation and healing are a process. Theologically, the issue with truth-telling goes back to the command of Jesus. In the Beatitudes in Matthew, Jesus tells his followers that they're not to swear an oath, but are just to say yes or no. Bonhoeffer suggests that the reason for that is that if our truthfulness depends on an oath, then every moment when we don't make one makes space for a lie. If the only guarantee of truthfulness is an oath, then every other moment makes space for a lie. So Jesus says, say just yes, just no, always truth-telling. I would suggest to you that we're to be truthful both in terms of what we tell and in terms of what we try not to tell, what we suppress from our memory and story. To tell an incomplete story or to pretend that something has not happened is often as big a lie as a deliberate falsehood. Let me just say a couple of other things, and I think Aunty Denise can then offer what she has to offer. The church has frequently shown more interest in reconciling relationships, in putting things right, than enabling people to face the truth. We often want to brush things under the table. The church has also contributed to the undermining of the history of others by its insistence that the history of Israel and the church is universal history. Other peoples are simply subtexts in the history of God and of the church, and their history only has value read against or in relationship to Christian history. We have to learn to honour the history of others as a history in its own right. And then let me close. One interesting claim of colonisation is that invasion and settlement are really good for the people, and I mentioned this last night. They're acts of Christian kindness. One of the claims made alongside that assertion was often the claim repeated that First Peoples were lucky it was the British who invaded and not some other country. Mike Davis has a book called Late Victorian Holocausts, and he points out that many nations, India and Ireland being two, would challenge that view of the benevolent British Empire. But that's the narrative that justifies colonisation and which truth-telling needs to dismantle. And finally, I believe Schultz is right when she says, that the necessary fictions of Australia's official foundation story, the one that starts with European sailors and offers a cursory nod to those who are already here, have become an increasingly threadbare, lazy shorthand for a much more complex identity. That identity requires truth-telling.
Good morning, everyone. I guess I just want to make a comment about truth-telling. I guess, since the beginning of colonisation and we've experienced genocide, basically, here in this country. It seems it doesn't seem possible. That only happens elsewhere, overseas. But increasingly, First Peoples have been recognising and saying, yes, we have experienced genocide, and it seems as if no one has been listening. And that's why these gatherings and a person like Chris is so important to the church, because the church is the prophetic voice. The church is the voice for peoples who have no voice. And we are fighting very hard to have a voice to Parliament, and that's part of what the Uluru statement asks for, is for a voice to Parliament, so that we will have a voice. I guess because you're never really sure, when somebody else speaks for you, whether they're actually speaking for you or speaking out of their own needs. To feel justified, or to feel, and sometimes it's misrepresented. It's not represented clearly. It's not interpreted. The interpretation sometimes is not quite right. It's not quite what Aboriginal people are saying. And it's sad, but sometimes second peoples do, they do say, well, it's the age-old, we know what's best for Aboriginal people. So, there's being able to represent and talk about what we need is something that's happened, for a long time. But Aboriginal people, I always say that Aboriginal people are masters of change. We have experienced change after change after change. We've adapted. We've learnt to speak this new language. We've learnt to live this new society as good as anyone. And so, we are able to speak now for ourselves, and we have been for a long time, right from the beginning, really. It's about, truth-telling is a lot about listening. Deep listening is needed, and sometimes that means throw the key away and use these that God has given us and this here. Listen with your heart. I guess, and we'll, God, there was one piece of wisdom that Kumanara Lester taught me, and it came from a little chorus, call unto me and I will answer thee and show thee great and mighty things which thou knowest not. Nobody knows, only God knows. And God will reveal things, as I believe that God is revealing things to us now through our Aboriginal spirituality lens. It's a new and fresh way of looking at things, looking at spirituality, of God being in this country long before 200 years ago. And so when we come to talk about history from an Indigenous perspective, we actually have to do that deep listening, and it's not easy. I remember sitting on the task group along with Bernie Clark, our good friend, and I don't know, Morel, were you on that? I know you were General Secretary at the time, but we had the task group for the Stolen Generation, and the South Australian Synod was the first synod to issue an apology to the Stolen Generation. That was a very moving time in the life of the church. And I remember at that time there was just the pain that the people that we spoke to, as they came in one by one lady from Croker Island, and we had to sit there and listen to her pain. She was swearing every second word. And she said, where was God? We were just children. Where was God? Cause you can imagine they'd been taught to pray to God and listen for, to do the right thing. And one of the things that has helped me with being able to, because I was very emotional during all of that time, probably during that decade, I didn't, everything was raw emotions, trauma. I think trauma was just was bubbling at the surface all the time, and having to speak about it over and over and over again. People just wanted you to come and tell your story. It was a very emotional time for me, and but I got through that period, and much stronger. And now I know to be able to just speak the truth. I'd never ever seen that passage of scripture in its full quote. I'd always just heard, missionaries had always quoted, "Let your yes be yes, your no be no," and I'd just left it at that. But of course, the full quote is, "Anything other than that is of the devil." So don't sit on the fence on anything. It's got to be yes or no. You leave that space, as Chris said. You do leave that space for something, other things to creep in and fill it. And I guess a last comment I would make is about truth-telling, is we need it. The church needs it. And when I hear scripture say, about this Lord, this Jesus that we serve, who has spoken about his life in identifying himself as the way, the truth, and the life. I often think about what does it mean to have truth, and it's so important for the work of the church in the area of Indigenous peoples, because as one of the points in the preamble states, and Chris, you might help me with the wording, that the integrity of the gospel was diminished. the integrity of the gospel was diminished. So even if me as a Christian minister, as accomplished as I am with my gift of speaking, went to my people and said, look, brother, God loves you, I'll pray for you. What kind of response do you think that's going to meet? When they've had years, decades, centuries of, being not seen and not heard. It makes it very difficult for us as a church to go to people to do mission. And that point about the integrity of the gospel is diminished. That's exactly what's happened. People don't want to know about this life-giving force in their lives. And how do we speak to people about God and ensure them that God is, that Jesus is the way, that Jesus is the truth, that Jesus is the life? We have to find another way of being the church. And, my prayer is that the church will be open to, help the Congress and other Indigenous parts of the church in the Catholic, in the other denominations as well, to see things differently. To have that open mind that I spoke about last night, and to encourage us to be able to work more in the area of Aboriginal spirituality. I think that, as I said, there's God has been with us right from the beginning, but there is a lot of work to do, and we have to find a way of explaining what's happened in our history that's hidden. It's a hidden history, and people are very afraid of the truth coming out, and there are forces that are working against the truth coming out, and we need to challenge those forces. We actually need to be able to put forward, use our voice, the voice of the church. We need to use that voice to be able to speak out the truth, to speak the truth. I remember going to South Africa, and I went to Johannesburg and went down to Soweto. We went to that place where the children, they were wanting, they were demonstrating against Afrikaans as the mode for educational, for learning. They kept saying, we have our language, and they were prepared to die for it. And the image of little children being shot down is a shocking image. And we went to that one place where this one little boy was rescued, and this older boy, he wasn't an acquaintance, he wasn't a relative. Even though the little boy had been shot and had already passed, he still went back for him. And that image of this little boy, lifeless body, being carried along by this stranger who thought that it was important to go back for him. And so, that images like that stick in my mind about what can we do to, help people who are voiceless, people who are lifeless, Many of them have a meaningless existence. You know, people, there are so many, my heart aches for our Indigenous people, and not only Indigenous people, but my passion is for Aboriginal people, and that is that, you know, to see that, you know, the Indigenous voice to be heard. And I think that we have to have truth-telling. It's so important. Thank you. Thank you, Chris.
Can I just very quickly add a fourth thing to my talk about what you need to do the journey? I think the other one is to accept the capacity of First Peoples, because that's often the hidden story. We pretend that people don't have capacity, and Aunty Denise reminded us that people have been engaged in this struggle for over 200 years. They have engaged in with deep capacity. So, you know, remember that. Yirrkala mission, which lies at the heart of the mission history of the Uniting Church, is often claimed as one of those great things that we did. In fact, what happened, as Bernie reminded us, is that the Aboriginal leaders of the place negotiated with each other a treaty to occupy somebody's land, and then invited the church to set up a mission there to protect them from the miners and the pastoralists. It was their action that created Yirrkala, not our action, which we tell as our history.